Welcome to the extraordinary story of Britain, a tale that spans hundreds of thousands of years and transforms a remote collection of islands into one of the most influential nations in human history. This is not merely a recounting of dates and battles, but a journey through time that reveals how geography, climate, culture, and human ambition shaped the land we know today as the United Kingdom. From the earliest human footsteps on British soil to the complex modern nation that emerged from centuries of conquest, rebellion, and evolution, we will explore how Britain became Britain. Our story begins in the mists of prehistory, long before written records existed, when the very landscape of these islands looked dramatically different from what we see today. Picture, if you will, a time when Britain was not an island at all, but connected to continental Europe by a vast land bridge called Doggerland. This was during the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, when sea levels were much lower, and what we now call the English Channel was a river valley inhabited by mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, and the earliest human hunters who dared to venture into these northern territories. The landscape of Ice Age Britain was both harsh and magnificent. Massive glaciers carved deep valleys through what would become the Scottish Highlands, while further south, vast tundra stretched across regions that would later support dense forests and fertile farmland. The Thames was not the gentle river we know today, but a powerful torrent fed by glacial melt, carving its path through a landscape of permafrost and scattered patches of hardy vegetation. Reindeer herds migrated across the open plains, followed by predators including cave lions, brown bears, and wolves, while overhead eagles and ravens soared through skies that often glowed with the ethereal light of the aurora borealis. The first humans to set foot on British soil were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, who arrived approximately 800,000 years ago. These were not the modern humans we know today, but earlier species, including Homo heidelbergensis and later Neanderthals, who left behind tantalizing clues of their presence in the form of stone tools and occasional bone fragments. At Boxgrove in Sussex, archaeologists have uncovered some of the earliest evidence of human activity in Britain, including beautifully crafted hand axes that demonstrate remarkable skill and planning. These early inhabitants lived in small nomadic groups, following herds of animals across the landscape and adapting to the harsh conditions of Ice Age Britain. The daily life of these ancient Britons required extraordinary resilience and ingenuity. They crafted tools from flint, wood, and bone, with a sophistication that modern experiments have shown to require years of practice and deep understanding of material properties. Their hand axes were not crude implements, but precisely shaped tools that could serve multiple functions, from butchering large animals to working wood and processing plant materials. The discovery of wooden spears at Clacton-on-Sea, dating to 400,000 years ago, reveals that these early humans were capable hunters who could plan and execute complex hunting strategies. Evidence suggests that these Paleolithic communities possessed sophisticated knowledge of fire-making and control, essential skills for survival in the harsh northern climate. Hearths discovered at sites like Beech's Pit in Suffolk show that they could maintain fires for extended periods, using them not only for warmth and cooking, but also for tool-making and possibly social gatherings. The ability to control fire represented a revolutionary technology that allowed human expansion into previously uninhabitable regions and fundamentally altered the relationship between humans and their environment. The climate during these early periods was far from stable. Britain experienced multiple ice ages, each one dramatically altering the landscape and forcing human populations to retreat south or adapt to increasingly challenging conditions. During the most severe glacial periods, ice sheets extended as far south as the Thames Valley, creating a landscape that would be virtually unrecognizable today. Tundra stretched across much of what is now England, while only the southern regions remained habitable for human populations. These climate fluctuations created a complex pattern of human occupation and abandonment that would be repeated many times over hundreds of thousands of years. During warmer interglacial periods, human populations would expand northward, establishing camps and hunting grounds across Britain. Archaeological evidence from sites like Swanscombe in Kent reveals that during these warmer periods, Britain supported diverse ecosystems that included straight-tusked elephants, hippos, and lions, creating hunting opportunities that attracted human groups from across Europe. The Neanderthals, who arrived in Britain around 60,000 years ago, represented a significant advancement in human adaptation to northern European conditions. These robust humans possessed larger brains than their predecessors and demonstrated remarkable cultural sophistication. At sites like Pontneud Cave in Wales, Archaeologists have found evidence of Neanderthal tool-making techniques that involved careful planning and the transport of raw materials over considerable distances. The Neanderthals also appear to have been the first humans in Britain to practice deliberate burial of their dead, suggesting complex spiritual beliefs and social structures. The extinction of the Neanderthals around 40,000 years ago coincided with the arrival of anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, who brought with them new technologies and cultural practices that would fundamentally transform human life in Britain. These new arrivals, often referred to as Cro-Magnons, possessed more sophisticated tool-making techniques, artistic abilities, and social organization that enabled them to thrive in challenging environments. As the ice began to retreat around 15,000 years ago, a new chapter in British prehistory began. The warming climate created opportunities for both animals and humans to recolonize the northern territories. Forests of birch and pine began to spread across the land, followed by oak, elm, and hazel, creating the dense woodlands that would characterize much of prehistoric Britain. This environmental transformation brought with it new challenges and opportunities for the human inhabitants. The process of reforestation was gradual but dramatic. Over the course of several millennia, the open tundra landscape gave way to vast forests that covered most of Britain. These woodlands were unlike any forest ecosystem that exists today, supporting populations of aurochs, wild boar, red deer, and elk that provided abundant hunting opportunities for human communities. The forest canopy created a complex vertical ecosystem, with different species occupying various levels from the forest floor to the emergent crowns of ancient oaks and elms. Around 10,000 years ago, rising sea levels finally severed the land bridge connecting Britain to continental Europe, creating the island nation that would play such a crucial role in world history. This geographic isolation would profoundly influence British development, creating a natural barrier that provided protection from continental invasions while simultaneously fostering unique cultural developments that distinguish British societies from their European neighbors. The creation of the English Channel was not a sudden event, but a gradual process that took place over several centuries. As glacial ice melted and sea levels rose, the low-lying plains of Doggerland were progressively flooded, creating first a series of islands and marshes, then narrow straits, and finally the broad channel that separates Britain from France today. This transformation had profound implications for the human communities that had been living in the region, forcing them to adapt to a maritime environment and develop new technologies for sea travel and coastal exploitation. The Mesolithic period, spanning from approximately 10,000 to 6,000 years ago, witnessed remarkable adaptations as human populations learned to thrive in the post-glacial environment. These hunter-gatherers developed sophisticated technologies for exploiting the rich resources of forest, river, and coastline. They crafted microliths, tiny stone tools that could be hafted onto wooden shafts to create effective arrows and spears. Their camps, scattered across Britain from Scotland to the south coast, reveal complex societies that maintained extensive trade networks and possessed detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns and animal behavior. Mesolithic communities developed an intimate relationship with their forest environment that encompassed not only hunting and gathering techniques, but also sophisticated understanding of forest ecology and management. Evidence suggests that these communities practiced controlled burning to maintain clearings and encourage the growth of particular plant species. They created networks of paths through the dense forest, marked by distinctive tree blazes and stone cairns that enabled navigation across vast distances. The toolkit of Mesolithic hunters was remarkably diverse and specialized. Beyond the famous microliths, they crafted bone and antler tools, including harpoons for fishing, needles for sewing, and complex composite tools that combined multiple materials. Their bows were sophisticated weapons made from yew wood and capable of accurately delivering arrows at considerable distances. The discovery of a complete Mesolithic bow at Holmegard in Denmark, similar to examples that would have been used in Britain, reveals the advanced woodworking skills of these communities. At Starcar in Yorkshire, one of the most important Mesolithic sites in Europe, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a settlement that was occupied seasonally for several centuries. The preservation conditions at this lakeside site have yielded remarkable organic materials including wooden tools, bone harpoons, and even headdresses made from deer skulls that may have been used in hunting rituals or ceremonies. These discoveries provide unprecedented insights into the daily lives, spiritual beliefs, and technological achievements of Britain's Mesolithic inhabitants. The Starcar site has revolutionized our understanding of Mesolithic society in Britain. The settlement was strategically located on the edge of an ancient lake, providing access to both aquatic and terrestrial resources. The inhabitants constructed a wooden platform extending into the lake, possibly serving as a dock for dugout canoes or a platform for fishing activities. The variety of animal remains found at the site, including red deer, roe deer, elk, aurochs, wild boar, and numerous bird species, demonstrates the diverse hunting strategies employed by the community. Perhaps most intriguingly, the deer skull headdresses found at Starkar suggest complex ritual practices that may have been associated with hunting magic or shamanic traditions. These carefully modified skulls, with the antlers removed and holes cut for attachment, represent some of the earliest evidence for symbolic behavior in post-glacial Britain. The fact that similar headdresses have been found at other Mesolithic sites across northern Europe suggests that these practices were part of a widespread cultural tradition. The transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture represents one of the most significant transformations in human history, and Britain experienced this revolution around 6,000 years ago during the Neolithic period. The arrival of farming communities from continental Europe brought not just new technologies and crops, but entirely different ways of organizing society and relating to the landscape. These Neolithic farmers introduced wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, and pigs to Britain, fundamentally altering both the environment and human society. The Neolithic Revolution in Britain was not simply a matter of adopting new technologies, but represented a fundamental shift in worldview and social organization. Hunter-gatherer societies had lived in harmony with natural cycles, taking what the environment provided and moving seasonally to exploit different resources. Farming communities, by contrast, sought to control and modify their environment, clearing forests, planting crops, and maintaining permanent settlements that required long-term planning and cooperation. The impact of this agricultural revolution cannot be overstated. For the first time in British history, human communities could support larger populations and permanent settlements. Surplus food production allowed for specialization of labor, leading to the development of pottery, weaving, and increasingly sophisticated stone tool technologies. The need to clear forests for farming created the first major human-induced changes to the British landscape, establishing patterns of land use that would persist for millennia. The process of forest clearance during the Neolithic period was extensive and systematic. Using stone axes with polished cutting edges, farming communities removed vast areas of woodland to create fields for crops and pastures for livestock. Pollen analysis from ancient lake sediments reveals the dramatic impact of this deforestation, showing sharp declines in tree species and corresponding increases in grasses and agricultural weeds. This transformation created the more open landscape that would characterize much of Britain for the remainder of prehistory and beyond. Neolithic pottery represents one of the most significant technological innovations of the period. The ability to create waterproof containers for storage, cooking, and serving food revolutionized domestic life and enabled new forms of food preparation and preservation. Early Neolithic pottery in Britain shows clear influences from continental European traditions, but quickly developed distinctive local characteristics that reflected the preferences and needs of British communities. Perhaps most remarkably, the Neolithic period witnessed the construction of some of Britain's most iconic and mysterious monuments. Beginning around 5,000 years ago, communities across Britain began building elaborate stone circles, burial chambers, and ceremonial complexes that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and planning. These monuments represent far more than simple burial sites or astronomical calendars. They embody the emergence of complex social hierarchies, sophisticated religious beliefs, and remarkable engineering capabilities. The monument-building tradition of Neolithic Britain encompassed a wide variety of structures, each serving different functions within the ritual and social landscape. Long barrows, such as those found at West Kennet and Wayland's Smithy, served as communal burial chambers where the remains of many individuals were interred over extended periods. These structures required the coordinated labor of entire communities and represented significant investments of time and resources that demonstrate the importance of ancestral veneration in Neolithic society. Causewayed enclosures, found across southern England, represent another category of Neolithic monument that may have served as gathering places for dispersed farming communities. These roughly circular earthworks, interrupted by numerous gaps or causeways, were not defensive structures, but rather ceremonial centers where communities could come together for trade, ritual activities, and social interaction. The presence of exotic artifacts and materials at these sites suggests that they played important roles in maintaining contact between distant communities. The most famous of these monuments is undoubtedly Stonehenge, but it represents just one example of a monument-building tradition that flourished across Neolithic Britain. From the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney to the stone circles of the Lake District, these structures demonstrate that Neolithic communities possessed not only the technical skills to transport and erect massive stones, but also the social organization necessary to coordinate such ambitious projects across generations. Stonehenge itself evolved over more than a millennium, beginning as a simple circular earthwork around 3,100 years ago, and gradually developing into the complex stone structure we recognize today. The earliest phase of construction involved the creation of a circular ditch and bank enclosing an area approximately 100 meters in diameter. Within this enclosure, a circle of 56 pits, known as the Aubrey Holes after their 17th century discoverer, may have held wooden posts or standing stones. The transportation of the massive sarsen stones from the Marlborough Downs, 20 miles away, and the smaller blue stones from Wales, over 150 miles distant, represents an extraordinary feat of prehistoric engineering and organization. Recent archaeological research has revealed that the site was part of a much larger sacred landscape, with ceremonial avenues, burial mounds, and other monuments extending for miles in every direction. The logistics of transporting the Stonehenge stones would have required hundreds of people working together over extended periods. The sarsen stones, some weighing over 40 tons, would have been moved using a combination of wooden rollers, ropes, and earthen ramps. The blue stones from Wales present an even greater puzzle, as their transport may have involved both overland and maritime routes. Some scholars have suggested that these stones were carried by glacial action, but the specific types of rock found at Stonehenge match outcrops in the Preseli Hills of Wales so precisely that human transport seems more likely. The purpose of Stonehenge continues to intrigue archaeologists and the public alike. While its precise function remains debated, the monument clearly served multiple roles as a burial ground, ceremonial center, and astronomical observatory. The careful alignment of the stones with solar and lunar cycles suggests that Neolithic communities possessed sophisticated understanding of celestial movements and incorporated this knowledge into their religious and social practices. Recent discoveries at Stonehenge have revealed that the site was used for burial purposes throughout its long history. Cremated remains found within and around the monument suggest that it served as a cemetery for elite individuals or families over many generations. The presence of exotic grave goods, including amber beads from the Baltic and gold ornaments from Ireland, indicates that those buried at Stonehenge had access to extensive trade networks and possessed considerable wealth and status. Equally impressive are the Neolithic monuments of Orkney, where exceptional preservation conditions have revealed not just stone circles and burial chambers, but entire settlements complete with stone furniture and decorated walls. At Skara Brae, often called Scotland's Pompeii, visitors can walk through houses that were occupied over 5,000 years ago, complete with stone beds, dressers, and hearths that provide intimate glimpses into Neolithic domestic life. The Orkney monuments represent perhaps the best preserved Neolithic landscape in Europe. The Ring of Brodgar, a stone circle containing 60 massive stones, stands within sight of the stones of Stennis, creating a ceremonial landscape that must have been of tremendous importance to Neolithic communities. The nearby chambered tomb of Maeshal, with its precisely aligned entrance passage and sophisticated corbelled roof, demonstrates architectural skills that rival those of any contemporary civilization. Skara Brae provides unparalleled insights into Neolithic domestic life. The village, buried and preserved by sand dunes for over 4,000 years, consists of 8 interconnected stone houses, each containing remarkably similar furnishings. Stone beds, dressers, and storage boxes reveal standardized concepts of domestic space and furniture. The discovery of gaming pieces, jewelry, and decorated pottery suggests that the inhabitants enjoyed leisure time and possessed aesthetic sensibilities that extended beyond mere survival. The emergence of metallurgy around 4,000 years ago marked the beginning of the Bronze Age, and another fundamental transformation of British society. The introduction of copper and later bronze tools and weapons represented a technological revolution that enhanced agricultural productivity, enabled more sophisticated craftsmanship, and fundamentally altered patterns of trade and social organization. Bronze Age Britain became part of extensive European trade networks that brought amber from the Baltic, gold from Ireland, and tin from Cornwall to create the alloys that defined the age. The development of bronze working technology required not only technical knowledge, but also access to raw materials that were not uniformly distributed across Britain. Copper ores were found primarily in Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, while tin was concentrated in Cornwall and Devon. This geographic distribution of resources created new forms of economic interdependence and stimulated trade relationships that connected previously isolated communities. The earliest bronze objects in Britain were simple tools and ornaments that closely resembled their stone and copper predecessors. However, as metallurgical skills developed, bronze workers began creating increasingly sophisticated objects that took advantage of the unique properties of the new alloy. Bronze axes were sharper and more durable than stone equivalents, while bronze spears and daggers provided superior weapons for hunting and warfare. Bronze Age communities developed increasingly complex social hierarchies, evidenced by elaborate burial practices and the accumulation of valuable grave goods. The Bush Barrow burial near Stonehenge, dating to around 4,000 years ago, contained one of the richest assemblages of Bronze Age artifacts ever discovered in Britain, including gold ornaments, bronze daggers, and a ceremonial mace that demonstrate both the technical skill of Bronze Age craftsmen and the emergence of powerful elite individuals who could command such valuable objects. The Bush Barrow burial reveals the extent to which Bronze Age society had become stratified. The individual buried there, presumably a man of high status, was accompanied by objects that represented enormous investments of skilled labor and valuable raw materials. A gold belt hook, decorated with intricate geometric patterns, demonstrates the sophisticated metalworking techniques that had developed by this period. Bronze daggers with wooden handles inlaid with thousands of tiny gold pins show the level of craftsmanship that elite patrons could command. The landscape of Bronze Age Britain was dramatically different from the heavily forested environment of earlier periods. Extensive forest clearance for agriculture and fuel had created a more open countryside of fields, pastures, and settlements connected by trackways and trade routes. The famous Sweet Track in the Somerset Levels, a wooden walkway built around 6,000 years ago, demonstrates the sophisticated engineering skills that Bronze Age communities applied to managing and moving through their environment. The Sweet Track represents one of the oldest engineered roads in the world, constructed across the marshy Somerset Levels to provide a reliable route between areas of higher ground. The trackway was built using split oak planks supported by crossed poles of ash, oak, and lime, creating a walkway that was both durable and flexible enough to accommodate the movement of the underlying peat. The precision of the construction and the quality of the woodworking demonstrate the high level of technical skill possessed by Bronze Age communities. Bronze Age communities also developed new forms of religious expression and social organization. The tradition of monument building continued, but took new forms, including stone circles with more complex astronomical alignments and elaborate burial mounds that served as focal points for community identity and ancestral veneration. The Uffington White Horse in Oxfordshire, a massive hill figure carved into the chalk downs, may date to this period and represents the kind of large-scale landscape art that required coordinated community effort and shared cultural meanings. The religious practices of Bronze Age communities appear to have involved both continuity with earlier traditions and significant innovations. Water appears to have held special significance, as evidenced by the large numbers of bronze objects deposited in rivers, lakes, and bogs. These deposits, which include weapons, tools, and ornaments, may represent ritual offerings to water deities or spirits. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water would continue throughout British prehistory and into the historical period. Trade and exchange became increasingly important during the Bronze Age, connecting British communities to networks that stretched across Europe and beyond. Irish gold, Cornish tin, and British wool were exchanged for amber, pottery, and luxury goods from continental Europe. These trade relationships not only brought new technologies and materials to Britain, but also facilitated the exchange of ideas, artistic styles, and cultural practices that enriched British society. The extent of Bronze Age trade networks is demonstrated by the distribution of distinctive artifact types across vast distances. Irish gold ornaments have been found as far away as Germany and Scandinavia, while amber from the Baltic appears in British burial contexts. Bronze Age hoards, collections of metal objects buried in the ground, often contain items from multiple regions, suggesting that individual communities had access to goods from across Europe. The development of bronze working technology required specialized knowledge and access to raw materials that were not uniformly distributed across Britain. This created new forms of economic and social differentiation as communities with access to metal sources or trade routes gained advantages over their neighbors. The emergence of specialist metalworkers, traders, and warriors began to create more complex social hierarchies that would characterize later periods of British history. Bronze Age metalworkers were highly skilled craftsmen who possessed knowledge that was probably closely guarded and passed down through family lines or craft guilds. The techniques required to produce high-quality bronze objects, including the creation of clay molds, the control of furnace temperatures, and the precise mixing of copper and tin, required years of training and experience. The workshops of these craftsmen, identified at sites like Flagfen in Cambridgeshire, reveal the sophisticated equipment and techniques used in bronze production. As Bronze Age society became more complex, so too did patterns of warfare and conflict. Bronze weapons enabled more effective military technologies, while growing populations and resource competition created new sources of tension between communities. Hill forts began to appear across Britain during the later Bronze Age, representing both defensive responses to increased conflict and symbols of community identity and territorial control. The hill forts of the later Bronze Age were impressive defensive structures that required significant community effort to construct and maintain. Sites like Rams Hill in Berkshire and Grimthorpe in Yorkshire feature elaborate earthwork defenses, including multiple ramparts, deep ditches, and carefully designed entrance passages that would have made assault extremely difficult. The construction of these fortifications suggests that Bronze Age communities faced real military threats and were willing to invest considerable resources in defensive measures. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age around 2,800 years ago marked yet another technological and social revolution. Iron tools and weapons were superior to bronze in many applications and could be produced from more widely available raw materials, democratizing access to metal technology and enabling further population growth and social complexity. The adoption of iron technology in Britain was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. Early iron objects were rare and valuable, often used alongside bronze tools and weapons. However, as ironworking techniques improved and became more widely known, iron gradually replaced bronze for most practical applications. The superior hardness and durability of iron tools revolutionized agriculture, craftsmanship, and warfare. Iron Age Britain witnessed the emergence of the Celtic cultures that would dominate the islands for centuries and leave lasting influences on British identity, language, and culture. The Celts were not a single people, but rather a collection of related cultures sharing similar languages, artistic traditions, and social structures that had spread across much of Europe during the first millennium before the Common Era. The Celtic peoples of Britain shared certain cultural characteristics with their continental relatives, including similar artistic styles, religious practices, and social organization. However, British Celtic culture also developed distinctive features that reflected local conditions and influences. The isolation provided by the English Channel allowed British Celtic societies to evolve in unique directions while maintaining connections with the broader Celtic world. Celtic Britain was characterized by tribal societies organized around kinship groups and territorial kingdoms that controlled specific regions of the islands. These tribes, including the Iceni of East Anglia, the Brigantes of northern England, and the Catuvellauni of the Thames Valley, developed sophisticated political structures, extensive trade networks, and distinctive artistic traditions that reflected both local identities and broader Celtic cultural patterns. The political organization of Celtic tribes was complex and varied considerably across different regions. Some tribes were ruled by kings or queens who held hereditary power, while others may have been governed by councils of elders or warrior aristocrats. The boundaries between tribes were fluid and often disputed, leading to frequent conflicts over territory, resources, and prestige. These political arrangements would have profound implications when Celtic Britain encountered the expanding Roman Empire. The Appada, or fortified settlements of Iron Age Britain, represent some of the most impressive achievements of Celtic civilization. Sites like Maiden Castle in Dorset and Danebury in Hampshire were massive hill forts that served as political, economic, and religious centers for their surrounding territories. These settlements could house thousands of inhabitants and featured complex defensive systems, storage facilities, and craft workshops that demonstrate the organizational capabilities of Iron Age societies. Maiden Castle, one of the largest and most complex hill forts in Europe, evolved over many centuries from a simple Neolithic causewayed enclosure to a massive Iron Age fortress covering 47 acres. The site's elaborate defensive earthworks, including multiple ramparts rising to heights of over 20 meters, would have required the coordinated labor of thousands of people. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of dense occupation, with circular houses, storage pits, and craft workshops distributed across the interior. The discovery of a war cemetery at Maiden Castle, containing the remains of individuals who died violently during the Roman conquest, provides dramatic evidence of the final chapter in the site's Iron Age history. The skeletons show clear signs of weapon wounds, including a skull pierced by a Roman ballista bolt, illustrating the deadly efficiency of Roman military technology when applied against Celtic fortifications. Celtic religious practices centered around natural features like springs, groves, and hilltops that were believed to be inhabited by gods and spirits. The Druids, a priestly class that maintained oral traditions, conducted religious ceremonies, and served as judges and teachers, played crucial roles in Celtic society. Their influence extended across tribal boundaries and helped maintain cultural continuity across the diverse Celtic world. The Druids represented one of the most distinctive features of Celtic civilization, serving as repositories of knowledge, law, and religious tradition. These learned men and women underwent lengthy training that could last 20 years or more, during which they memorized vast amounts of poetry, law, history, and religious lore. The Druids' refusal to commit their knowledge to writing helped maintain their monopoly on learning and ensured the preservation of Celtic traditions across generations. Archaeological evidence for Celtic religious practices comes primarily from votive deposits and sanctuary sites where offerings were made to the gods. At sites like Lyn Cerrig Bach in Wales and the Thames at London, hundreds of weapons, tools, and ornaments have been recovered from ancient riverbeds, suggesting that water held special significance in Celtic religion. These deposits often include the finest examples of Celtic craftsmanship, indicating that only the most valuable objects were considered worthy offerings to the gods. The artistic achievements of Celtic Britain are perhaps best represented by the Latin style, characterized by flowing, abstract designs that adorned everything from weapons and jewelry to ceremonial objects and architectural elements. The Battersea Shield, discovered in the Thames and dating to the 1st century before the Common Era, exemplifies the sophisticated metalworking skills and aesthetic sensibilities of Celtic craftsmen. Celtic art in Britain developed distinctive characteristics that set it apart from continental European styles, while maintaining connections to the broader Latine tradition. British Celtic artists showed particular skill in creating complex interlaced patterns and stylized animal forms that would later influence medieval manuscript illumination and stone carving. The use of enamel inlays and coral decorations demonstrates the sophisticated techniques available to Celtic craftsmen and their access to exotic materials through trade networks. The Snettisham treasure, discovered in Norfolk and dating to the 1st century before the Common Era, represents one of the finest collections of Celtic goldwork ever found. The hoard includes several magnificent torques, twisted gold neck rings that served as symbols of status and wealth among Celtic elites. The Great Torque of Snettisham, weighing over 1 kilogram and decorated with intricate relief patterns, demonstrates the extraordinary skill of Celtic goldsmiths and the wealth of Iron Age British society. Celtic society was not uniformly peaceful or isolated. Warfare between tribes was common, driven by competition for territory, resources, and prestige. The warrior culture of the Celts emphasized individual heroism and martial skill, values that were celebrated in oral traditions and reflected in elaborate weapons and armor found in archaeological contexts. Celtic warfare involved both individual combat between champions and larger conflicts between tribal armies. Warriors fought with iron swords, spears, and shields, often decorated with elaborate artistic designs that proclaimed their owner's status and achievements. The discovery of war cemeteries and weapon deposits provides evidence of the scale and intensity of Celtic conflicts, while classical authors describe the fierce reputation of Celtic warriors throughout the ancient world. The use of war chariots represents one of the most distinctive aspects of Celtic military culture in Britain. While chariots had largely disappeared from continental European warfare by the Iron Age, British Celts continued to use them effectively in battle well into the Roman period. These vehicles, drawn by 2 horses and carrying a driver and warrior, provided mobility and psychological impact that made them formidable weapons in the hands of skilled fighters. Trade relationships connected Celtic Britain to the broader European world, bringing Mediterranean goods like wine and olive oil to British shores in exchange for metals, slaves, and other resources. These connections would prove crucial when Roman merchants and eventually Roman armies began to take interest in the wealth and strategic importance of the British Isles. The extent of pre-Roman trade between Britain and the Mediterranean world is demonstrated by archaeological finds of Roman pottery, wine amphorae, and other luxury goods at British sites dating to the 1st century before the Common Era. These imports were concentrated at major oppida and elite burial sites, suggesting that trade relationships were controlled by Celtic aristocrats who used exotic goods to display their wealth and status. The stage was thus set for one of the most dramatic transformations in British history, the Roman conquest that would bring these islands into the orbit of classical civilization and fundamentally alter the trajectory of British development. The Celtic tribes that controlled Britain at the dawn of the Common Era had created sophisticated societies with rich cultural traditions, but they were about to encounter a military and political force unlike anything they had previously experienced. Julius Caesar's expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 before the Common Era marked the beginning of Roman involvement in British affairs, though these initial invasions were more exploratory than conquest-oriented. Caesar's own accounts describe a land of fierce warriors, mysterious druids, and valuable resources that captured Roman imagination and ambition. His descriptions of British war chariots, tribal customs, and natural wealth would influence Roman perceptions of Britain for generations. Caesar's first expedition was launched with limited forces and achieved only modest success. Landing on the beaches of Kent, the Romans encountered fierce resistance from British tribes who used their knowledge of local conditions to harass the invaders. The sight of British war chariots, unknown in Gaul for generations, initially caused panic among Roman troops who had never encountered such tactics. However, Roman discipline and superior equipment eventually prevailed, and Caesar was able to secure tribute from several tribal leaders before withdrawing to Gaul. The second expedition, launched the following year with a much larger force, achieved greater success and penetrated deeper into British territory. Caesar crossed the Thames and defeated the powerful Cativaloni tribe, securing the submission of numerous British leaders and establishing diplomatic relationships that would influence British politics for decades. However, the expedition was still essentially a large-scale raid rather than a conquest, and Caesar withdrew to Gaul without establishing permanent Roman presence in Britain. The century between Caesar's expeditions and the Claudian invasion of 43 Common Era witnessed significant changes in both Roman and British societies. Roman expansion across Gaul brought Roman influence to the very shores of the English Channel, while British tribes engaged in increasingly complex relationships with Roman merchants, diplomats, and political refugees. Some British rulers, like Cunobelinus of the Cativaloni, adopted Roman customs and maintained diplomatic relationships with Rome, while others remained fiercely independent. The political situation in Britain during this period was fluid and complex, with tribal alliances shifting in response to both internal dynamics and external pressures from the expanding Roman Empire. The death of Cunobelinus around 40 Common Era created a succession crisis that provided the Romans with the pretext they needed for full-scale invasion. Cunobelinus, known to Shakespeare as Cymbeline, had ruled much of southeastern Britain for several decades and maintained generally peaceful relationships with Rome. His coins, which copied Roman designs and included Latin inscriptions, demonstrate the extent to which some British elites had adopted Roman cultural forms. However, his sons Caratacus and Togodumnus took a more aggressive stance toward Rome, providing Emperor Claudius with the justification he needed for invasion. Emperor Claudius, seeking military glory to legitimize his reign, authorized the invasion of Britain in 43 Common Era under the command of Aulus Plautius. This was no mere raiding expedition like Caesar's earlier ventures, but a full-scale conquest designed to incorporate Britain into the Roman Empire permanently. The invasion force of approximately 40,000 troops represented one of the largest military operations in Roman history and demonstrated the empire's commitment to British conquest. The initial Roman landing at Richborough in Kent met with fierce resistance from British tribes, but superior Roman military organization, technology, and tactics gradually overcame Celtic opposition. The Battle of the Medway, fought shortly after the landing, resulted in a decisive Roman victory that opened the path to the Thames in the heart of southern Britain. The Roman military machine that invaded Britain in 43 Common Era represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution and experience. The legions were professional soldiers trained to fight as coordinated units, equipped with standardized weapons and armor, and supported by sophisticated logistics systems that could maintain armies in the field for extended periods. This professional military force was fundamentally different from the warrior bands of Celtic Britain, which relied on individual heroism and tribal loyalty rather than systematic training and organization. The capture of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, marked a crucial milestone in the Roman conquest. This former capital of Cunobelinus became the first Roman colonia in Britain and served as the administrative center for the new province. The establishment of Roman institutions, the construction of temples and public buildings, and the settlement of Roman veterans transformed Camulodunum into a symbol of Roman power and civilization. The transformation of Camulodunum into a Roman city involved massive construction projects that demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities and administrative efficiency. The construction of a forum, basilica, theater, and temple complex created an urban environment that was entirely foreign to British experience. The Temple of Claudius, in particular, served as a powerful symbol of Roman imperial authority and divine legitimacy that was deeply resented by many Britons. However, Roman conquest was far from complete or uncontested. The western and northern regions of Britain remained under Celtic control, and even in conquered territories, resistance continued in various forms. The most famous of these resistance movements was led by Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, whose rebellion in 60 or 61 Common Era nearly succeeded in driving the Romans from Britain entirely. Boudica's rebellion was triggered by Roman mistreatment of her family and people following the death of her husband, King Prasutagus, who had been a Roman client ruler. The Roman seizure of Iceni lands, the flogging of Boudica, and the rape of her daughters sparked an uprising that quickly spread beyond the Iceni to include other tribes who had suffered under Roman rule. The causes of Boudica's rebellion lay deep in the fundamental contradictions of Roman rule in Britain. While Rome claimed to bring civilization and prosperity to conquered peoples, the reality of Roman administration often involved exploitation, cultural suppression, and personal humiliation that generated intense resentment. The treatment of Boudica and her family represented the kind of arbitrary brutality that could transform loyal allies into implacable enemies. The rebel forces achieved stunning initial successes, destroying Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, and massacring thousands of Roman settlers and British collaborators. Archaeological evidence from these sites reveals the ferocity of the destruction, with thick layers of ash and burned debris marking the path of Boudica's army. The destruction of Camulodunum was particularly symbolic, as the rebels targeted the Temple of Claudius and other monuments to Roman power. The archaeological record reveals evidence of systematic destruction that went beyond military necessity to represent a deliberate rejection of Roman cultural and religious authority. The discovery of decapitated skulls and other evidence of ritual violence suggests that the rebellion incorporated religious and cultural elements that reflected deep-seated British resentment of Roman rule. The Roman response was swift and brutal. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, recalled from his campaign in Wales, assembled his forces and met Boudica's army in a decisive battle at an unknown location somewhere in the Midlands. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Roman discipline and tactics prevailed, and the rebellion was crushed with tremendous loss of life. Boudica herself died, either in battle or by suicide, but her memory would endure as a symbol of British resistance to foreign domination. The final battle of Boudica's rebellion demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Celtic military culture. The British forces, though numerous and highly motivated, lacked the discipline and coordination necessary to defeat a professional Roman army in pitched battle. The Roman victory was achieved through superior tactics, equipment, and training that overcame the numerical disadvantage and fierce determination of the British warriors. The aftermath of Boudica's rebellion led to significant changes in Roman policy toward Britain. The brutal suppression of the revolt was followed by more conciliatory policies designed to win over the British population through incentives rather than coercion alone. Roman administrators began to work more closely with British tribal leaders, incorporating them into the Roman system while respecting some local customs and traditions. The new approach to governing Britain involved a careful balance between Roman authority and British autonomy that sought to prevent future rebellions while maintaining effective control. Roman officials began to recruit British elites into the imperial administration, offering them opportunities for advancement and enrichment within the Roman system. This policy of cooperation and assimilation would prove more successful than the harsh measures that had triggered Boudica's rebellion. The process of Romanization accelerated during the later 1st century Common Era as British elites increasingly adopted Roman customs, education, and lifestyle. The construction of Roman-style villas, the adoption of Roman dress and dining customs, and the education of British children in Latin and Roman culture created a hybrid Romano-British civilization that combined elements of both traditions. This cultural transformation was not uniform across Britain, but was most pronounced in the southeastern regions that had been under Roman control the longest. Archaeological evidence reveals the gradual adoption of Roman building techniques, pottery styles, and burial practices that demonstrate the appeal of Roman culture to British elites. However, traditional Celtic practices continued in many areas, creating a complex cultural landscape that reflected both Roman influence and British resistance. Roman military campaigns continued to push the boundaries of the province northward and westward. The conquest of Wales was completed under Governor Frontinus in the 70s Common Era, while successive campaigns against the Caledoni and other Scottish tribes extended Roman influence as far north as the Highlands. The construction of Hadrian's Wall in the 120s Common Era marked the practical northern limit of Roman control and created one of the most impressive monuments of Roman engineering in Britain. The conquest of Wales represented a particularly challenging campaign that required Roman forces to adapt to mountainous terrain and guerrilla warfare tactics employed by Welsh tribes. The final assault on the Druid stronghold at Anglesey, described in dramatic terms by the Roman historian Tacitus, symbolized the destruction of Celtic religious authority and the triumph of Roman civilization over barbarian superstition. Hadrian's Wall stretched 73 miles from Wallsend on the River Tyne to Bowness on Solway, representing not just a military barrier but a symbol of Roman power and organization. The wall incorporated 16 major forts, numerous smaller installations, and a complex system of roads and supply lines that supported a garrison of approximately 9,000 troops. The construction of this massive fortification required unprecedented coordination of labor, materials, and logistics that demonstrated Roman administrative capabilities. The engineering achievement represented by Hadrian's Wall cannot be overstated. The structure required the quarrying and transport of millions of tons of stone, the construction of sophisticated drainage systems, and the creation of supply networks that could maintain thousands of soldiers in a remote frontier region. The precision of the construction and the quality of the stonework demonstrate the high level of technical skill possessed by Roman military engineers. Life along Hadrian's Wall developed its own unique character, as soldiers from across the Roman Empire were stationed in the northern frontier. Archaeological evidence reveals a cosmopolitan military community that included troops from Germany, Spain, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, creating a multicultural society on the edge of the Roman world. The civilian settlements that grew up around the forts, known as vici, became centers of trade and cultural exchange that connected the Roman and Celtic worlds. The diversity of the frontier population is reflected in religious practices, dietary habits, and material culture found at wall sites. Temples to gods from across the empire, including Mithras from Persia and Jupiter, Dolichanes from Syria, demonstrate the religious pluralism of the frontier community. The discovery of exotic foods, spices, and luxury goods reveals the extent to which even remote military outposts remained connected to Mediterranean trade networks. The Antonine Wall, built further north in Scotland during the 140s Common Era, represented the high-water mark of Roman expansion in Britain. However, this more advanced position proved difficult to maintain, and the Romans eventually withdrew to Hadrian's Wall, which remained the effective border of Roman Britain for the remainder of the occupation. The failure to hold the Antonine Wall reflected both the practical difficulties of maintaining extended supply lines and the fierce resistance of Scottish tribes who refused to accept Roman rule. The decision to withdraw to Hadrian's Wall represented a recognition that Roman resources were better concentrated on defending a more manageable frontier than stretched thin across an extended and hostile territory. Roman Britain during the 2nd and 3rd centuries Common Era experienced a period of relative peace and prosperity that allowed Romano-British civilization to flourish. The development of towns and cities, the expansion of agriculture, and the growth of trade and industry created a complex economy that integrated Britain into the broader Roman world while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. This period of prosperity was built on the foundations laid during the conquest period, but represented a maturation of Romano-British society that went far beyond mere military occupation. The growth of urban centers, the development of sophisticated villa estates, and the expansion of trade networks created a civilization that was recognizably Roman while retaining distinctively British characteristics. The great Roman cities of Britain, including Londinium, Eboracum, and Aquae Sulis, became centers of Roman civilization that rivaled their continental counterparts. Londinium, in particular, grew to become one of the largest cities north of the Alps, with a population that may have reached 60,000 at its peak. The city's location at the lowest crossing point of the Thames made it a natural center for trade and administration, while its port facilities connected Britain to the Mediterranean world. The urban development of Roman London was remarkable for its speed and sophistication. Within decades of its founding, the city boasted a forum larger than that of Rome itself, a basilica for legal and commercial activities, public baths, amphitheaters, and residential districts that housed a diverse population of merchants, craftsmen, and administrators. The discovery of writing tablets, legal documents, and personal letters reveals a literate urban society engaged in complex commercial and social activities. The Roman villa system transformed the British countryside, as wealthy landowners built elaborate country estates that combined agricultural production with luxurious living. Villas like Fishbourne in Sussex and Chedworth in Gloucestershire featured sophisticated architectural elements including hypocaust heating systems, elaborate mosaic floors, and formal gardens that demonstrated the adoption of Mediterranean lifestyle in the British climate. The villa at Fishbourne represents one of the most spectacular examples of Romano-British domestic architecture. Built in the 1st century Common Era, possibly for a British client king, the complex covered several acres and included over 100 rooms arranged around formal courtyards. The elaborate mosaic floors, painted wall plaster, and imported marble decorations demonstrate the wealth and sophistication of the villa's inhabitants. Roman engineering transformed the British landscape through the construction of roads, aqueducts, and public buildings that improved transportation, sanitation, and quality of life. The Roman road system, including famous routes like Watling Street and Ermine Street, connected all parts of the province and facilitated the movement of troops, goods, and information across the island. The Roman road network in Britain was planned and constructed with characteristic Roman efficiency and precision. Major routes like Watling Street, which ran from Dover to Chester, were built to exacting standards with solid foundations, cambered surfaces for drainage, and regular maintenance stations. These roads not only served military purposes but also facilitated trade and communication that helped integrate Britain into the Roman world. The introduction of Roman law, administration, and education created new opportunities for social mobility and cultural advancement. British elites could pursue careers in the Roman military or civil service, while Roman citizenship offered legal protections and privileges that were highly valued. The spread of Latin literacy enabled participation in the broader intellectual culture of the Roman world. The educational system introduced by the Romans provided British elites with access to classical learning and culture that had previously been unavailable. Schools in major towns taught Latin grammar, rhetoric, and literature, while wealthy families employed private tutors to educate their children in Roman customs and values. This educational transformation created a Romano-British elite that was culturally integrated into the empire while maintaining connections to local British traditions. Religious life in Roman Britain reflected the complex interactions between Roman, Celtic, and other traditions. While Roman gods were officially promoted and temples built in their honor, Celtic deities continued to be worshipped, often in syncretized forms that combined Roman and Celtic attributes. The temple complex at Bath, dedicated to Sulis Minerva, exemplifies this religious fusion, where the Celtic goddess Sulis was identified with the Roman Minerva. The religious landscape of Roman Britain was remarkably diverse and tolerant, reflecting both official Roman policy and the practical necessities of governing a multicultural population. The imperial cult, which required recognition of the emperor's divine status, provided a unifying religious focus, while local deities and customs were generally permitted to continue alongside Roman practices. Christianity began to spread in Britain during the 3rd century Common Era, initially among urban populations and gradually extending to rural areas. The martyrdom of St. Alban during the Diocletian persecution around 300 Common Era demonstrates that Christian communities had become established enough to attract official attention and persecution. The growth of Christianity in Roman Britain followed patterns similar to those in other parts of the empire, with the new religion initially appealing to urban populations and gradually spreading to rural areas. Archaeological evidence for early Christian communities includes churches, baptisteries, and Christian symbols found at sites across Britain, demonstrating the gradual but steady growth of the faith. The economic prosperity of Roman Britain was built on diverse foundations including agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and trade. British wool became famous throughout the Roman world, while the lead mines of the Mendips and the silver mines of Wales contributed to imperial revenues. The pottery industry of the New Forest and other regions supplied both local and export markets, while British oysters were considered delicacies in Rome itself. The agricultural system of Roman Britain was highly productive and sophisticated, incorporating both Roman techniques and local adaptations. The introduction of new crops, improved plowing methods, and systematic field systems increased agricultural productivity and supported larger populations. The development of specialized farming regions, such as the grain-producing areas of East Anglia and the cattle-raising districts of the north, created an integrated agricultural economy that supplied both local needs and export markets. However, the 3rd century also brought challenges to Roman Britain in the form of increased barbarian raids, economic difficulties, and political instability within the empire itself. Saxon pirates began raiding the eastern coasts, leading to the construction of a chain of coastal fortifications known as the Saxon shore forts. These impressive fortifications, including those at Richborough, Dover, and Porchester, represented a new phase of Roman military architecture designed to counter seaborne threats. The Saxon shore forts were massive stone fortifications that combined traditional Roman military architecture with innovations designed to counter new types of threats. These forts featured high walls, projecting bastions, and sophisticated gate systems that could withstand both siege warfare and surprise attacks. The construction of these fortifications required enormous resources and demonstrated the seriousness of the Saxon threat. The political crisis of the 3rd century, which saw the Roman Empire nearly collapse under the pressure of civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic inflation, also affected Britain. The province briefly became part of the breakaway Gallic Empire under Postumus and his successors, demonstrating both the challenges facing central Roman authority and the increasing autonomy of provincial populations. The Gallic Empire, which included Britain, Gaul, and parts of Spain, represented an attempt to create a more manageable and defensible political unit in the face of barbarian invasions and imperial instability. While ultimately unsuccessful, this experiment demonstrated the growing importance of regional identities and the practical difficulties of governing a vast empire from a distant capital. The restoration of imperial unity under Diocletian and Constantine brought renewed stability to Roman Britain, but also marked the beginning of significant changes in the nature of Roman rule. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves, the establishment of new capitals, and the legalization of Christianity all had profound implications for Britain's place within the Roman world. Diocletian's administrative reforms divided Britain into 4 separate provinces, each with its own governor and administrative structure. This division was designed to improve efficiency and reduce the risk of rebellion, but also reflected the growing complexity of governing the British territories. The new system created more opportunities for British elites to participate in imperial administration while maintaining tighter central control. Constantine's victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 Common Era and his subsequent conversion to Christianity transformed the religious landscape of the Roman Empire and Britain. The Edict of Milan in 313 Common Era legalized Christianity throughout the empire, leading to the construction of churches and the open practice of Christian worship in Britain. The legalization of Christianity had profound implications for British society and culture. The construction of churches, the establishment of bishoprics, and the development of Christian communities created new forms of social organization and cultural expression. The integration of Christian and Roman traditions would prove particularly important for the survival of Roman culture in post-imperial Britain. The Council of Arles in 314 Common Era included 3 British bishops, demonstrating that Christian communities had become well established and organized in Britain by the early 4th century. Archaeological evidence for early Christian churches and artifacts becomes increasingly common during this period, indicating the rapid spread of the new religion among both urban and rural populations. The British bishops who attended the Council of Arles represented established Christian communities with sophisticated organizational structures. The presence of bishops from York, London, and possibly Lincoln demonstrates that Christianity had spread to major urban centers and developed institutional frameworks that connected British churches to the broader Christian world. However, the 4th century also witnessed growing pressures on Roman Britain from external threats and internal challenges. The Great Conspiracy of 367 Common Era saw coordinated attacks by Picts, Scots, Saxons, and other barbarian groups that temporarily overwhelmed Roman defenses and required major military intervention to restore order. These attacks demonstrated the increasing difficulty of maintaining Roman control over Britain's extended frontiers. The Great Conspiracy represented the most serious external threat to Roman Britain since Boudicca's rebellion 3 centuries earlier. The coordination between different barbarian groups, the simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts, and the temporary collapse of Roman authority revealed fundamental weaknesses in the province's defensive systems. The conspiracy also demonstrated the growing sophistication of Britain's enemies and their ability to exploit Roman vulnerabilities. The response to the Great Conspiracy involved significant changes to Britain's military organization and defensive strategy. Count Theodosius, sent to restore order, rebuilt damaged fortifications, reorganized military commands, and established new defensive arrangements that acknowledged the changing nature of the threats facing the province. Theodosius's reforms included the recruitment of barbarian foederati, allied troops who served Roman interests in exchange for land and payment. This policy represented a fundamental shift in Roman military strategy and acknowledged the empire's growing dependence on barbarian manpower. However, the use of barbarian troops also created new risks and complications that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of Roman authority. The reign of Magnus Maximus, a Spanish-born general who was proclaimed emperor in Britain in 383 Common Era, illustrates both the continuing importance of Britain within the Roman system and the growing tendency toward regional independence. Maximus's bid for imperial power, though ultimately unsuccessful, required him to withdraw significant military forces from Britain for his continental campaigns, weakening the province's defenses at a crucial time. Magnus Maximus's usurpation reflected both the ambitions of the Romano-British elite and the practical difficulties of governing the empire from distant capitals. His initial success in gaining support from British troops and civilians demonstrated the continuing loyalty of Britain to Roman ideals, while his ultimate failure illustrated the challenges facing regional challengers to imperial authority. The gradual withdrawal of Roman military forces from Britain during the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Common Era, was driven by the empire's need to defend more threatened frontiers, particularly along the Rhine and Danube rivers where barbarian pressure was intensifying. The famous letter of Honorius to the British cities in 410, Common Era, advising them to look to their own defenses, effectively marked the end of Roman political control over Britain. The end of Roman rule in Britain was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process of withdrawal and abandonment that took place over several decades. As imperial resources became increasingly stretched, Britain's remote location and relative security made it a logical candidate for reduced military presence. The withdrawal of the legions did not immediately end Roman influence, but it did mark the beginning of a new chapter in British history. However, the end of Roman rule did not mean the immediate disappearance of Roman civilization in Britain. Romano-British communities continued to maintain Roman customs, law, and lifestyle for generations after the withdrawal of imperial administration. The survival of Latin literacy, Christian institutions, and Roman architectural styles demonstrates the deep roots that Roman civilization had established in British soil. The persistence of Roman culture in post-imperial Britain varied considerably across different regions and social groups. Urban centers that had been most thoroughly Romanized showed the greatest continuity, while rural areas that had maintained stronger Celtic traditions experienced less disruption. The survival of Roman institutions depended largely on the ability of local elites to maintain the economic and social structures that supported them. The transition from Roman Britain to post-Roman Britain was gradual and varied significantly across different regions of the island. In some areas, Romano-British elites continued to exercise authority and maintain Roman-style governance, while in others, new forms of organization emerged that combined Roman and Celtic traditions. The legendary figure of Arthur, whether historical or mythical, represents the kind of Romano-British leader who may have emerged during this transitional period to defend Roman civilization against barbarian invasions. The Arthurian legends, while largely mythical, may preserve memories of real Romano-British leaders who attempted to maintain Roman civilization in the face of Saxon invasions. The archaeological record provides evidence of continued resistance to Saxon expansion well into the 6th century, suggesting that Romano-British communities were not passive victims but active participants in the struggle to preserve their way of life. The economic systems established during the Roman period also showed remarkable persistence in some regions. Archaeological evidence suggests that some villas continued to be occupied and maintained well into the 5th century, while urban centers like Bath and York retained significant populations and economic activity even after the collapse of imperial administration. The survival of Roman economic structures depended largely on the maintenance of trade networks and the continued availability of skilled craftsmen and administrators. In regions where these conditions persisted, Roman-style life could continue for generations, while in areas where they broke down, alternative forms of organization quickly emerged. The Christian Church provided perhaps the most important element of continuity between Roman and post-Roman Britain. Christian communities that had been established during the later Roman period continued to function and even expand after the end of imperial rule. The survival of Christian institutions, including monasteries and bishoprics, helped preserve elements of Roman learning and culture that would prove crucial for the future development of British civilization. The role of the Church in preserving Roman culture cannot be overstated. Christian monasteries served as repositories of Latin learning, Roman law, and classical literature that might otherwise have been lost. The continued use of Latin in religious contexts helped maintain connections to the broader Christian world and preserve linguistic skills that would prove valuable in later periods. The linguistic legacy of Roman Britain is complex and debated among scholars. While Latin ceased to be the language of administration and high culture after the Roman withdrawal, it continued to be used by the Christian Church and educated elites. The extent to which Latin influenced the development of Welsh and other Celtic languages remains a subject of scholarly investigation, but clear Latin borrowings and vocabulary and place names demonstrate the lasting impact of Roman linguistic culture. The survival of Latin place names across Britain provides clear evidence of the depth of Roman influence. Names like Chester, Lancaster, and Gloucester preserve the Latin castra, meaning fortified camp, while names like Stratford and Stretford derive from the Latin strata, meaning paved road. These linguistic survivals demonstrate that Roman influence penetrated deeply into British consciousness and continued to shape the way people understood and described their landscape. The archaeological record reveals that the end of Roman rule brought significant changes to material culture, but not the complete abandonment of Roman practices. Pottery styles evolved, but maintained some Roman characteristics, while building techniques and settlement patterns showed both continuity and innovation. The famous Anglo-Saxon burial at Sutton Hoo, while clearly representing a non-Roman culture, also included objects and influences that demonstrate the complex cultural interactions of post-Roman Britain. The material culture of post-Roman Britain reveals a complex process of cultural transformation that involved both continuity and change. While distinctively Roman artifacts became less common, many Roman techniques and traditions continued to influence British craftsmen and builders. The gradual evolution of pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and architectural forms demonstrates the persistence of Roman influence even as new cultural traditions emerged. As Roman political authority collapsed and new peoples began to settle in Britain, the stage was set for the next great transformation in British history. The arrival of Anglo-Saxon settlers, the survival of Celtic kingdoms in Wales and Scotland, and the gradual emergence of new political structures would create the medieval foundations of English civilization. But the Roman legacy would continue to influence British development for centuries to come, providing legal precedents, architectural models, urban planning concepts, and cultural memories that would be repeatedly rediscovered and reimagined by later generations. The story of Roman Britain thus represents not just a period of foreign occupation, but a fundamental transformation that created many of the basic patterns of British civilization. The integration of Britain into a Mediterranean world system, the development of urban culture, the establishment of legal and administrative institutions, and the introduction of Christianity all had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the end of Roman rule. Understanding this Roman foundation is essential for comprehending how Britain evolved from a collection of Celtic tribes into the complex medieval kingdoms that would eventually unite to form the modern United Kingdom. The Roman period established patterns of government, law, and culture that would influence British development for over a millennium. The concept of centralized administration, the use of written law, the development of urban centers, and the integration of diverse populations under a common political system all became enduring features of British civilization. Even as successive waves of invaders and settlers transformed the political landscape, these fundamental Roman innovations continued to shape the way British society organized itself and understood its place in the world. The collapse of Roman authority in Britain around 410 marked not an ending but a transformation, as new peoples began to arrive on British shores while existing populations adapted to rapidly changing circumstances. The Anglo-Saxons, comprising primarily Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from what is now Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands, initially came as hired mercenaries to defend Romano-British settlements against Pictish and Scottish raids. However, These Germanic warriors soon recognized the opportunities presented by a land whose central authority had crumbled, and what began as military service evolved into permanent settlement and territorial conquest. Archaeological evidence from 5th century sites across eastern and southern England reveals a complex process of cultural transformation rather than simple replacement. Anglo-Saxon burial practices, characterized by cremation urns and grave goods, including weapons, jewelry, and domestic items, appear alongside Romano-British Christian burials, suggesting periods of coexistence and gradual cultural blending. The famous cemetery at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, dating to the early 7th century, demonstrates the sophisticated material culture that emerged from this fusion, combining Germanic artistic traditions with Mediterranean luxury goods and Christian symbolism. The Anglo-Saxon settlement pattern differed dramatically from Roman urbanism. While Roman Britain had been organized around towns and cities connected by roads, Anglo-Saxon society was fundamentally rural and tribal. Villages consisting of timber halls surrounded by smaller buildings housed extended family groups, while larger settlements centered on the great halls of warrior kings. These halls, like the reconstructed example at West Stow in Suffolk, served multiple functions as residences, meeting places, and symbols of royal authority. The archaeological record shows that many Roman towns were abandoned or significantly reduced in size, as the new settlers preferred dispersed agricultural communities over concentrated urban centers. The political organization of early Anglo-Saxon Britain reflected Germanic tribal traditions adapted to British conditions. Kinship groups formed the basic social unit, with loyalty to family and warband taking precedence over territorial allegiance. Warrior kings emerged as leaders of these groups, their authority based on personal charisma, military success, and the ability to distribute wealth to followers. The concept of the comitatus, a band of warriors bound to their lord by oaths of mutual loyalty, became central to Anglo-Saxon political culture and would profoundly influence later medieval institutions. By the 6th century, numerous Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had emerged across England, each controlling distinct territories and competing for dominance. The Kingdom of Kent, established in the southeast, maintained close connections with Frankish Gaul and served as a conduit for continental influences. Wessex controlled much of southern England, while Mercia dominated the Midlands, and Northumbria extended across northern England and southern Scotland. These kingdoms were not static entities but constantly shifting alliances and territories through warfare, marriage, and negotiation. The arrival of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England represented another transformative moment in British history. St. Augustine's mission to Kent in 597, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, established Roman Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons, while Celtic Christianity continued to flourish in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. The conversion process was gradual and often politically motivated, as kings recognized the advantages of aligning with the powerful Christian kingdoms of continental Europe. The Synod of Whitby in 6064 resolved disputes between Roman and Celtic Christian practices, establishing Roman customs as standard throughout England and strengthening ties with continental Europe. The fusion of Germanic and Christian traditions produced a distinctive Anglo-Saxon culture that found expression in literature, art, and architecture. Epic poems like Beowulf combined heroic Germanic values with Christian moral teachings, while illuminated manuscripts such as the Lindisfarne Gospels demonstrated sophisticated artistic techniques blending Celtic, Germanic, and Mediterranean influences. Stone churches began to replace wooden halls as centers of community life, introducing new architectural forms and decorative styles that would influence British building traditions for centuries. The development of written law codes marked another significant Anglo-Saxon innovation. Kings like Ethelbert of Kent and Inne of Wessex issued comprehensive legal codes that codified customary practices and established royal authority over justice. These laws, written in the vernacular rather than Latin, made legal procedures accessible to broader populations and created precedents for later English common law. The emphasis on compensation rather than punishment for most crimes, the recognition of different social classes with corresponding legal rights, and the integration of Christian moral principles into secular law all became enduring features of English legal tradition. Anglo-Saxon England also witnessed significant economic development as agricultural productivity increased and trade networks expanded. The introduction of the heavy plow allowed cultivation of heavier soils previously unsuitable for farming, while new crop rotation systems increased yields. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hamwick, near modern Southampton, reveals extensive trading connections with continental Europe, Scandinavia, and even the Mediterranean. Anglo-Saxon coins, initially modeled on Frankish examples but later developing distinctive English characteristics, facilitated long-distance commerce and demonstrated the growing sophistication of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The 8th century marked the height of early Anglo-Saxon achievement, with kingdoms like Mercia under King Offa achieving unprecedented power and influence. Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork extending along the Welsh border, demonstrated the organizational capacity of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and their ability to undertake major infrastructure projects. Offa's correspondence with Charlemagne reveals that Anglo-Saxon rulers were recognized as equals by the most powerful continental monarchs, while his legal and administrative innovations influenced governmental development throughout medieval Europe. However, this period of Anglo-Saxon consolidation faced a new and devastating challenge with the arrival of Viking raiders in the late 8th century. The attack on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 shocked Christian Europe and announced the beginning of the Viking Age in Britain. Unlike earlier migrations, Viking raids initially focused on quick strikes against wealthy targets, particularly monasteries that housed valuable treasures and manuscripts. The mobility provided by their superior ships allowed Viking raiders to strike coastal and riverine targets throughout Britain and Ireland with devastating effectiveness. The impact of Viking raids extended far beyond immediate destruction and plunder. Monasteries, which had served as centers of learning, manuscript production, and cultural preservation, were particularly vulnerable to attack. The disruption of monastic life led to temporary declines in literacy, artistic production, and intellectual development. However, the threat also spurred defensive innovations, including the construction of fortified towns called burhs and the development of more effective military organizations. The transition from raiding to settlement marked a new phase in Viking involvement with Britain. Beginning in the mid-9th century, Viking armies began establishing permanent bases and conquering territory for settlement, rather than merely plundering. The Great Army that arrived in 865 represented a coordinated invasion force capable of sustained military campaigns against Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Led by figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan, this army conquered York, established control over much of northern and eastern England, and forced Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to pay tribute or face destruction. The Viking conquest of York in 866 created Jorvik, which became one of the most important commercial and cultural centers in medieval Europe. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate have revealed a thriving urban community engaged in craft production, trade, and cultural exchange. Viking York maintained connections with Scandinavia, Ireland, the Baltic, and even Byzantium, making it a crucial link in medieval trade networks. The fusion of Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures in York created distinctive artistic styles, architectural forms, and social institutions that influenced development throughout northern England. The establishment of the Danelaw, the area of England under Viking control and law, created a complex political and cultural landscape. Viking settlers, known as Danes regardless of their specific origins, established their own legal traditions, settlement patterns, and governmental structures alongside existing Anglo-Saxon institutions. Place names throughout eastern England still reflect this Viking heritage, with endings like by, Thorpe, and Thwaite indicating Danish settlement. The legal concept of the Danelaw recognized that different populations could live under different legal systems within the same kingdom, establishing precedents for legal pluralism that would influence later English development. The resistance to Viking conquest was led most effectively by Alfred the Great of Wessex, whose reign from 871 to 8799 marked a turning point in Anglo-Saxon fortunes. Alfred's military innovations, including the construction of fortified towns and the creation of a standing army, enabled successful defense against Viking attacks. His victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 forced the Viking leader Guthrum to accept baptism and establish the boundaries between Wessex and the Danelaw. Alfred's subsequent treaty with Guthrum recognized Viking territorial control while preserving Anglo-Saxon independence in the south and west. Alfred's achievements extended far beyond military success to encompass legal, educational, and cultural reforms that earned him recognition as one of the greatest rulers in English history. His law code synthesized earlier Anglo-Saxon legal traditions with Christian principles and practical governance needs, creating a comprehensive legal framework that influenced English law for centuries. Alfred's educational program, which included translating important Latin works into English and establishing schools, helped preserve and transmit classical and Christian learning during a period of cultural disruption. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun during Alfred's reign, represents one of the most important historical sources for medieval English history. This vernacular chronicle, maintained at various monasteries throughout England, provides contemporary accounts of political events, social developments, and cultural changes from the 9th through 12th centuries. The chronicle's use of English rather than Latin made historical knowledge accessible to broader audiences and demonstrated the growing confidence in vernacular culture that characterized Alfred's reign. Alfred's successors, particularly Edward the Elder and Aethelstan, continued the process of reconquest and unification that would create the Kingdom of England. The systematic construction of fortified towns, the organization of effective military forces, and the gradual absorption of Viking territories extended West Saxon authority throughout England. Aethelstan's victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 against a coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Strathclyde Welsh established him as the first king to rule all of England and demonstrated the military effectiveness of reformed Anglo-Saxon institutions. The 10th century witnessed the emergence of England as a unified kingdom under West Saxon leadership. But this unification required constant military effort and political negotiation. The integration of the Danelaw posed particular challenges, as Viking settlers maintained their own cultural traditions, legal practices, and political loyalties. The gradual conversion of Viking settlers to Christianity helped facilitate integration, but cultural differences remained significant. Archaeological evidence from sites like York reveals the persistence of Scandinavian artistic styles, burial practices, and material culture well into the 11th century. The reign of Edgar the Peaceful from 959 to 975 marked the height of late Anglo-Saxon achievement. Edgar's coronation at Bath in 973, attended by kings from throughout Britain, symbolized English dominance and the success of West Saxon unification efforts. The Regularis Concordia, issued during Edgar's reign, standardized monastic practices throughout England and demonstrated royal authority over religious institutions. Edgar's legal reforms, administrative innovations, and cultural patronage created the governmental and institutional framework that would characterize medieval England. However, the succession crisis following Edgar's death in 975 revealed the fragility of Anglo-Saxon unity. The murder of Edward the Martyr in 978 and the accession of Ethelred the Unready marked the beginning of a period of political instability that would ultimately lead to foreign conquest. Aethelred's reign was characterized by renewed Viking raids, internal political conflicts, and the gradual breakdown of the defensive systems established by Alfred and his successors. The resumption of large-scale Viking raids under leaders like Olaf Tryggvason and Sweyn Forkbeard exposed the weaknesses of late Anglo-Saxon government. The policy of paying Danegeld, tribute money to buy off Viking raiders, provided temporary relief but ultimately encouraged further attacks. The St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, in which Aethelred ordered the killing of Danish settlers throughout England, demonstrated the breakdown of the accommodation between Anglo-Saxon and Viking populations that had characterized earlier periods. Sweyn Forkbeard's conquest of England in 1013 and the subsequent rule of his son Canute marked the end of independent Anglo-Saxon kingship. However, Cnut's reign from 1016 to 1035 demonstrated the possibility of successful integration between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Cnut maintained Anglo-Saxon legal and administrative institutions while bringing England into a North Sea empire that included Denmark and Norway. His law codes, issued in both English and Latin, synthesized Anglo-Saxon and Danish legal traditions while emphasizing Christian principles and royal authority. The restoration of Anglo-Saxon kingship under Edward the Confessor in 1042 represented both continuity and change in English political development. Edward's long exile in Normandy had exposed him to continental influences, while his childless marriage ensured that the succession question would dominate the later years of his reign. The growing influence of Norman advisors and the promise of the succession to William of Normandy created tensions with Anglo-Saxon nobles who favored Harold Godwinson's claim to the throne. The Anglo-Saxon period thus concluded with England as a unified kingdom possessing sophisticated governmental institutions, a rich cultural tradition, and extensive international connections. The fusion of Germanic, Celtic, Christian, and Viking influences had created a distinctive English identity that would survive foreign conquest and continue to evolve throughout the medieval period. The legal traditions, administrative practices, and cultural achievements of Anglo-Saxon England provided the foundation for later English development and established many of the characteristics that would distinguish English civilization throughout its subsequent history. The Norman conquest of 1066 represents one of the most decisive moments in British history, fundamentally transforming English society, culture, and political organization. William the Conqueror's victory at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, marked not merely a change of dynasty, but the beginning of a comprehensive reorganization of English life that would influence British development for centuries to come. The conquest brought England into the mainstream of European feudalism, while introducing new architectural styles, legal concepts, and cultural traditions that would blend with existing Anglo-Saxon and Viking influences to create medieval English civilization. The immediate aftermath of Hastings demonstrated William's determination to establish complete control over his new kingdom. The systematic construction of castles throughout England, beginning with the Tower of London, provided secure bases for Norman forces while symbolizing the new political order. These stone fortifications, built using continental techniques and designs, represented a revolution in military architecture that made traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive strategies obsolete. The speed with which Norman forces established control over strategic locations throughout England testified to both their military efficiency and the thoroughness of their planning. The harrying of the North in 1069 and 1070 revealed the brutal methods William employed to crush Anglo-Saxon resistance. The systematic destruction of villages, crops, and livestock across Yorkshire and neighboring counties created a famine that lasted for years and demonstrated the consequences of opposing Norman rule. Contemporary sources describe the devastation as so complete that the region remained depopulated and uncultivated for decades, earning William condemnation from chroniclers but effectively ending organized Anglo-Saxon resistance. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, represents the most comprehensive administrative achievement of the Norman conquest and provides unparalleled insight into 11th century English society. This detailed survey of landholding, population, and resources throughout England demonstrated the administrative sophistication of Norman government while serving practical purposes of taxation and military organization. The systematic collection of information about every manor, village, and town revealed the extent of Norman control and provided the statistical foundation for effective governance. The feudal system introduced by the Normans restructured English society around relationships of land tenure and military service. William's distribution of English estates to Norman followers created a new aristocracy bound to the crown by feudal obligations while displacing the Anglo-Saxon nobility. The concept of feudal tenure, whereby all land was ultimately held from the king in exchange for military service, provided a theoretical framework for royal authority while creating practical mechanisms for military organization and political control. However, the implementation of feudalism in England differed significantly from continental models due to the survival of Anglo-Saxon legal and administrative traditions. The shire system, with its sheriffs and local courts, continued to function alongside feudal institutions, creating a hybrid governmental structure that combined Norman feudal hierarchy with Anglo-Saxon administrative efficiency. This fusion of Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions would prove crucial to the later development of English common law and parliamentary government. The cultural impact of the Norman conquest extended far beyond political and administrative changes to encompass language, literature, art, and architecture. The introduction of Norman French as the language of court and government created a trilingual society in which Latin served religious and scholarly functions, French dominated aristocratic and legal discourse, and English remained the language of the common people. This linguistic diversity enriched English vocabulary and literary traditions while creating social distinctions that persisted for centuries. Norman architecture revolutionized English building traditions through the introduction of Romanesque styles characterized by massive stone construction, rounded arches, and elaborate decorative schemes. The reconstruction of major cathedrals like Durham and Canterbury demonstrated Norman architectural ambitions while providing models for subsequent English building projects. The fusion of Norman structural techniques with Anglo-Saxon decorative traditions created distinctive English Romanesque styles that influenced ecclesiastical and secular architecture throughout the medieval period. The Norman reorganization of the English Church brought England into closer alignment with continental Christianity while maintaining some distinctively English characteristics. The appointment of Norman bishops and abbots, the reconstruction of cathedrals and monasteries, and the introduction of new monastic orders like the Cluniacs transformed English religious life. However, the survival of Anglo-Saxon saints' cults, the continuation of vernacular religious traditions, and the adaptation of Norman practices to English conditions created a synthesis that preserved elements of pre-conquest Christianity. The The reign of William Rufus from 1087 to 1100 demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of early Norman rule. Rufus's effective military leadership maintained Norman control over England and extended Norman influence into Wales and Scotland, while his administrative efficiency generated the revenues necessary for continental campaigns. However, his conflicts with the church, his arbitrary taxation, and his personal behavior created tensions that would influence later developments in the relationship between crown and nobility. The accession of Henry I in 1100 marked a new phase in Norman development, as the king sought to consolidate Norman rule through legal and administrative reforms. Henry's Charter of Liberties, issued upon his coronation, represented an early attempt to define royal authority and limit arbitrary government, establishing precedents that would influence later constitutional developments. His marriage to Matilda of Scotland, a descendant of Anglo-Saxon kings, symbolized the gradual integration of Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions while legitimizing Norman rule in English eyes. Henry's administrative innovations, particularly the development of the exchequer system for financial administration, created governmental institutions that would serve as models for later medieval governments throughout Europe. The pipe rolls, detailed financial records maintained by the exchequer, provide remarkable insight into the resources and administrative capacity of Norman government. The systematic collection and recording of royal revenues demonstrated the bureaucratic sophistication that distinguished Norman administration from earlier governmental systems. The succession crisis following Henry's death in 1035 plunged England into a period of civil war known as the Anarchy, which lasted until 1053. The conflict between Stephen of Blois and Matilda, Henry's daughter, revealed the instability inherent in feudal succession practices while demonstrating the resilience of Norman administrative institutions. Despite widespread warfare and political chaos, the basic structures of Norman government survived, and local administration continued to function even when central authority collapsed. The resolution of the anarchy through the Treaty of Wallingford in 1053 established Henry II as king and founded the Plantagenet dynasty, which would rule England for over 3 centuries. Henry's accession brought England into the Angevin Empire, a collection of territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees that made the English king one of the most powerful rulers in medieval Europe. This continental connection would profoundly influence English political development while creating conflicts of loyalty and interest that would persist throughout the medieval period. Henry II's legal reforms represent one of the most significant achievements of medieval English government and established the foundation for the English common law system. The creation of royal courts with jurisdiction throughout England, the development of standardized legal procedures, and the compilation of legal precedents created a unified legal system that superseded local customs and feudal privileges. The constitutions of Clarendon in 1064 attempted to define the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical courts, creating conflicts with the church that culminated in the murder of Thomas Becket in 1070. The Becket controversy demonstrated the tensions inherent in Norman attempts to control both secular and religious authority. Thomas Becket's transformation from royal chancellor to defender of church privileges symbolized the broader conflict between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence that characterized medieval politics. Becket's martyrdom and subsequent canonization created a powerful symbol of resistance to royal tyranny, while establishing Canterbury as one of Europe's most important pilgrimage destinations. Henry's administrative reforms extended beyond legal innovation to encompass military organization, financial management, and territorial administration. The development of scutage, a tax paid in lieu of military service, provided the crown with resources to hire professional soldiers while reducing dependence on feudal levies. The systematic survey of royal rights and resources, the establishment of standardized weights and measures, and the creation of efficient record-keeping systems demonstrated the administrative sophistication of Plantagenet government. The expansion of English influence into Wales and Ireland during Henry's reign established patterns of English colonization that would persist for centuries. The Norman conquest of parts of Wales and the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in 1069 brought Celtic populations under English authority while creating new opportunities for land acquisition and political advancement. However, these conquests also created ongoing conflicts between English settlers and Celtic populations that would influence British politics throughout the medieval period. The reign of Richard I from 1089 to 1099 demonstrated both the advantages and disadvantages of England's continental connections. Richard's participation in the Third Crusade enhanced English prestige and established connections with Mediterranean powers, while his military reputation earned him recognition as one of medieval Europe's greatest warriors. However, his prolonged absences from England and his expensive military campaigns placed enormous financial burdens on English resources while creating opportunities for political instability. The administrative efficiency developed during Henry II's reign enabled England to function effectively even during Richard's absences, demonstrating the institutional strength of Plantagenet government. The regency arrangements, the continued operation of royal courts, and the systematic collection of revenues showed that Norman administrative innovations had created governmental institutions capable of surviving weak or absent kingship. This institutional resilience would prove crucial during later periods of political crisis and civil conflict. John's reign from 1099 to 1016 marked a turning point in English constitutional development, as baronial opposition to royal authority culminated in Magna Carta in 1015. The loss of Normandy in 1004 and John's subsequent military failures undermined royal prestige, while his financial demands and arbitrary government alienated the nobility. The baronial revolt that forced John to accept Magna Carta established precedents for limiting royal authority that would influence English constitutional development for centuries. Magna Carta represented not a democratic document, but an attempt by feudal barons to protect their traditional rights against royal encroachment. However, the Charter's provisions regarding legal procedure, taxation, and governmental accountability established principles that would be reinterpreted by later generations as foundations for constitutional government. The requirement that the king observe legal procedures, the limitation on arbitrary taxation, and the recognition of baronial rights to resist tyrannical government created precedents that would influence later struggles between Crown and Parliament. The minority of Henry III from 1016 to 1027 demonstrated the continuing evolution of English governmental institutions, as regency councils maintained royal authority while developing new procedures for consultation and decision-making. The systematic administration of royal government during Henry's minority, the successful defense of royal authority against foreign invasion, and the gradual restoration of royal finances showed that English institutions had achieved sufficient maturity to function effectively even during periods of weak kingship. Henry's personal rule from 1027 to 1072 witnessed the further development of English governmental institutions alongside growing tensions between royal authority and baronial privileges. Henry's patronage of continental artists and architects, his support for new monastic orders, and his promotion of learning and culture enhanced England's reputation while creating financial burdens that strained royal resources. The construction of Westminster Abbey in its present form symbolized both Henry's cultural ambitions and the architectural achievements of 13th-century England. The baronial opposition that emerged during Henry's later reign reflected broader changes in English society as the nobility developed more sophisticated concepts of political participation and governmental accountability. The provisions of Oxford in 1058 represented an attempt to institutionalize baronial control over royal government, while the subsequent Civil War demonstrated the continuing tensions between royal prerogative and aristocratic privilege. Simon de Montfort's Parliament of 1065, which included representatives from towns and shires alongside the nobility, established precedents for broader political participation that would influence later parliamentary development. The resolution of the baronial wars through the Dictum of Kenilworth in 1066 and the Statute of Marlborough in 1067 demonstrated the growing sophistication of English legal and political institutions. The systematic restoration of royal authority, the confirmation of Magna Carta's provisions, and the establishment of procedures for resolving political conflicts created a framework for constitutional government that balanced royal prerogative with baronial rights while recognizing the interests of broader social groups. Edward I's reign from 1072 to 1037 marked the culmination of medieval English governmental development as the king systematically reformed legal, administrative, and military institutions while expanding English authority throughout Britain. Edward's legal reforms, embodied in statutes like Quo Warranto and Quia Emptores, clarified feudal relationships while strengthening royal authority over land tenure and local government. The systematic codification of legal procedures, the expansion of royal court jurisdiction, and the development of new legal remedies created a comprehensive legal system that served as a model for later European developments. Edward's military innovations, particularly his use of longbow tactics and siege warfare, revolutionized medieval military technology while enabling successful campaigns in Wales and Scotland. The conquest of Wales between 1077 and 1084 brought the last independent Welsh principalities under English control while demonstrating the military effectiveness of reformed English armies. The construction of massive stone castles like Caernarfon and Harlech established English authority throughout Wales, while creating architectural monuments that symbolized English power. The Scottish wars that dominated Edward's later reign revealed both the strengths and limitations of English military and political power. Edward's initial success in asserting English overlordship over Scotland, symbolized by his removal of the Stone of Scone in 1096, demonstrated English military superiority while creating lasting resentments that would influence Anglo-Scottish relations for centuries. However, the Scottish resistance led by William Wallace and Robert Bruce showed that military conquest alone could not create lasting political control over determined populations. Edward's parliamentary innovations established institutional frameworks that would characterize English government throughout the later medieval period. The Model Parliament of 1095, which included representatives from shires, towns, and clergy alongside the nobility, created precedents for regular consultation between crown and subjects that would evolve into the parliamentary system. Edward's recognition that effective government required broader consent, particularly for taxation, established principles of political participation that would influence later constitutional development. The reign of Edward II from 1307 to 1027 demonstrated the continuing tensions between royal authority and baronial power while revealing the institutional strength of English government. Edward's military failures in Scotland, particularly his defeat at Bannockburn in 1014, undermined royal prestige, while his favoritism toward Piers Gaveston and later the Despensers alienated the nobility. However, the systematic operation of royal administration, the continued functioning of parliamentary institutions, and the maintenance of legal procedures showed that English governmental institutions had achieved sufficient stability to survive weak kingship. The deposition of Edward II in 1027 established important precedents for limiting royal authority while demonstrating the evolution of English constitutional concepts. The formal process of deposition, involving Parliament's declaration that Edward had violated his coronation oath, created legal justifications for resistance to tyrannical government that would influence later political crises. The regency established for Edward III demonstrated the continuing development of institutional solutions to problems of royal minority and governmental continuity. Edward III's reign from 1027 to 1077 marked the height of medieval English power and cultural achievement as military success in France enhanced royal prestige, while parliamentary institutions achieved greater definition and authority. The beginning of the Hundred Years' War in 1037 provided opportunities for military glory and territorial expansion, while creating financial pressures that strengthened parliamentary control over taxation. Edward's victories at Crécy in 1046 and Poitiers in 1056 established English military superiority while demonstrating the effectiveness of new tactical innovations. The development of Parliament during Edward III's reign established institutional frameworks that would characterize English government for centuries. The regular summoning of Parliament for taxation approval, the separation of Lords and Commons into distinct houses, and the development of parliamentary procedures for legislation and petition created a governmental system that balanced royal prerogative with representative institutions. The Good Parliament of 1076 demonstrated parliamentary willingness to criticize royal government while establishing precedents for ministerial accountability that would influence later constitutional development. The cultural achievements of 14th century England, symbolized by figures like Geoffrey Chaucer and the anonymous author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, demonstrated the maturity of English literary and artistic traditions. The development of English as a literary language capable of sophisticated expression, the fusion of continental and insular cultural influences, and the patronage provided by royal and aristocratic courts created conditions for cultural flowering that established England as a major center of European civilization. The Black Death of 1048 to 1050 represented a demographic catastrophe that fundamentally transformed English society while revealing the resilience of English institutions. The massive population decline, estimated at between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's inhabitants, created labor shortages that undermined traditional feudal relationships while creating opportunities for social mobility. The Statute of Laborers, which attempted to maintain pre-plague wage levels, demonstrated governmental efforts to preserve traditional social structures, while revealing the impossibility of resisting fundamental economic changes. The Peasants' Revolt of 1081 marked the culmination of social tensions created by economic change and demonstrated the political consciousness of English common people. The revolt's demands for the abolition of serfdom, the limitation of rents, and the punishment of corrupt officials revealed sophisticated political thinking among the peasantry while demonstrating their capacity for organized resistance. The revolt's ultimate failure showed the continuing strength of traditional authority, but its occurrence revealed fundamental changes in English social relationships that would influence later political development. Richard II's reign from 1077 to 1099 witnessed the continuing evolution of English political institutions, alongside growing tensions between royal authority and parliamentary power. Richard's assertion of royal prerogative, particularly his claim to rule by divine right independent of parliamentary consent, created conflicts that culminated in his deposition in 1099. The merciless Parliament of 1088 demonstrated parliamentary willingness to control royal government through impeachment and other constitutional mechanisms that would influence later political crises. The deposition of Richard II and the accession of Henry IV established the Lancastrian dynasty while creating precedents for parliamentary involvement in royal succession. Henry's recognition that his title depended on parliamentary approval rather than hereditary right established important constitutional principles, while creating practical necessities for cooperation between Crown and Parliament. The systematic justification of Henry's usurpation through legal and constitutional arguments demonstrated the sophistication of English political thought while establishing precedents that would influence later struggles over royal authority. Henry IV's reign from 1099 to 1013 revealed the challenges facing a usurping dynasty while demonstrating the continuing strength of English institutions. The Welsh Revolt, led by Owain Glyndwr, the Percy rebellions in northern England, and the continuing threat from supporters of Richard II created military and political pressures that strained royal resources while testing the loyalty of English nobility. However, the systematic operation of parliamentary government, the continued functioning of legal institutions, and the maintenance of administrative efficiency showed that English governmental systems had achieved sufficient maturity to survive political instability. Henry V's reign from 1013 to 1022 marked the renewal of English military success in France, while demonstrating the effectiveness of parliamentary cooperation in supporting royal policy. Henry's victory at Agincourt in 1015 established him as one of Europe's greatest military commanders, while his systematic conquest of Normandy demonstrated English military and administrative capabilities. The Treaty of Troyes in 1020, which recognized Henry as heir to the French throne, represented the height of English territorial ambitions while creating obligations that would strain English resources for decades. The minority of Henry VI from 1022 to 1029 and his subsequent personal rule until 1061 demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of English governmental institutions. The regency councils that governed during Henry's minority maintained effective administration while developing procedures for consultation and decision-making that would influence later constitutional development. However, Henry's personal inadequacies as king, his mental instability, and his inability to provide effective leadership created conditions for the civil conflicts that would dominate the later 15th century. The Wars of the Roses, which began in the 1050s and continued intermittently until 1087, represented the culmination of tensions between competing noble factions while demonstrating the resilience of English institutions. The conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York revealed the instabilities inherent in feudal succession practices, while showing the continuing importance of parliamentary legitimation for royal authority. The systematic operation of local government, the continued functioning of legal institutions, and the maintenance of commercial activity during periods of civil war demonstrated the institutional strength that would enable England to emerge from the conflicts with enhanced governmental capacity. Edward IV's reign from 1061 to 1083, interrupted by Henry VI's brief restoration in 1070 to 1071, marked the beginning of institutional reforms that would characterize early modern English government. Edward's administrative innovations, his promotion of commercial development, and his systematic efforts to restore royal finances created foundations for the governmental expansion that would occur under the Tudor dynasty. The printing of books, beginning with William Caxton's press at Westminster in 1076, revolutionized the transmission of knowledge while creating new possibilities for governmental communication and popular education. Richard III's brief reign from 1083 to 1085 demonstrated the continuing importance of legitimacy in English kingship, while revealing the limitations of royal authority unsupported by broader consent. Richard's usurpation of the throne from his nephew Edward V, the mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower, and his defeat at Bosworth Field in 1085 showed that effective kingship required not merely military success, but also acceptance by nobility, Parliament, and popular opinion. Henry VII's victory at Bosworth and his subsequent reign from 1085 to 1009 marked the beginning of the Tudor dynasty and the transition from medieval to early modern government. Henry's systematic efforts to restore royal authority, his innovative financial policies, and his careful management of noble relationships created conditions for governmental expansion while establishing precedents for royal authority that would influence his successors. The marriage of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon symbolized England's integration into European diplomatic networks, while creating matrimonial complications that would influence later religious and political developments. The Tudor period, beginning with Henry VII's succession in 1085, marked a fundamental transformation in English government, religion, and society that would establish the foundations for modern British civilization. Henry VIII's reign from 1009 to 1047 witnessed revolutionary changes in religious authority, governmental structure, and England's international position that fundamentally altered the character of English kingship while creating institutional frameworks that would influence British development for centuries. The English Reformation, initiated by Henry's break with Rome in the 1030s, represented far more than a royal divorce case, fundamentally transforming English society through the dissolution of monasteries, the redistribution of ecclesiastical property, and the establishment of royal supremacy over religious matters. The Act of Supremacy in 1034, which declared Henry to be supreme head of the Church of England, created a national church under royal control while establishing precedents for governmental authority over religious matters that would influence later constitutional development. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1036 and 1041 represented one of the largest transfers of property in English history, fundamentally altering social relationships while providing the crown with resources for governmental expansion. The systematic seizure of monastic lands, their sale to nobility and gentry, and their conversion to secular uses created new patterns of land ownership while destroying institutions that had provided education, charity, and cultural preservation for centuries. However, the redistribution of monastic wealth also created new opportunities for social mobility, while strengthening the landed classes that would support Protestant settlement. Thomas Cromwell's administrative reforms during the 1030s created governmental institutions that would characterize early modern English administration. The development of new secretarial departments, the systematization of record-keeping procedures, and the expansion of royal bureaucracy created administrative capacity that enabled the Crown to implement religious and social changes throughout England. Cromwell's use of Parliament to legitimize religious changes established precedents for legislative involvement in religious matters, while demonstrating the effectiveness of parliamentary cooperation in implementing royal policy. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1036 revealed both popular opposition to religious changes and the military effectiveness of Tudor government. The revolt, which encompassed much of northern England and attracted support from all social classes, demonstrated the depth of attachment to traditional religious practices while revealing regional resistance to governmental centralization. However, Henry's systematic suppression of the revolt, his execution of its leaders, and his subsequent strengthening of royal authority in northern England showed the Crown's determination to enforce religious uniformity while establishing precedents for dealing with popular resistance. Edward VI's reign from 1047 to 1053, conducted under the regencies of Edward Seymour and John Dudley, witnessed the systematic implementation of Protestant reforms that established England as a Protestant nation. The Book of Common Prayer, first issued in 1049 and revised in 1052, created a uniform liturgy for the Church of England while demonstrating the government's commitment to Protestant theology. The systematic removal of Catholic imagery, the dissolution of chantries, and the promotion of Protestant clergy created a religious settlement that would influence English Christianity for centuries. The succession crisis following Edward's death in 1053 revealed the continuing importance of legitimacy in English kingship while demonstrating popular attachment to traditional succession practices. Lady Jane Grey's brief reign, lasting only 9 days, showed the limitations of noble conspiracy unsupported by broader consent, while Mary Tudor's successful assertion of her hereditary right demonstrated popular commitment to legitimate succession, even when it meant accepting Catholic restoration. Mary I's reign from 1053 to 1058 represented a systematic attempt to restore Catholic Christianity while revealing the institutional changes created by the English Reformation. Mary's reconciliation with Rome, her restoration of Catholic liturgy, and her persecution of Protestant clergy demonstrated royal determination to reverse religious changes while creating martyrs whose sufferings would influence later Protestant identity. However, the survival of Protestant sentiment, the resistance to papal authority, and the practical difficulties of restoring ecclesiastical property showed that the Reformation had created irreversible changes in English society. Elizabeth I's accession in 1058 marked the beginning of a reign that would establish England as a major European power while creating religious and political settlements that would influence British development for centuries. The Elizabethan religious settlement, embodied in the Act of Supremacy and Act of Uniformity of 1059, established a moderate Protestant church that avoided theological extremes while maintaining royal control over religious matters. Elizabeth's careful balance between Protestant doctrine and Catholic ceremonial created a religious settlement that satisfied most English people while establishing the Church of England as a distinctive religious institution. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1088 represented a turning point in European history that established England as a major naval power while demonstrating the effectiveness of English military and administrative institutions. The systematic preparation for Spanish invasion, the coordination of naval and land forces, and the mobilization of popular support showed the organizational capacity of Elizabethan government while creating national confidence that would influence later imperial expansion. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe and other English voyages of exploration established England as a maritime nation while creating precedents for later colonial development. The Elizabethan cultural achievement, symbolized by figures like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser, demonstrated the maturity of English literary and artistic traditions while establishing cultural foundations that would influence British civilization for centuries. The development of English drama, the flourishing of lyric poetry, and the creation of architectural masterpieces like Hardwicke Hall showed that England had achieved cultural sophistication comparable to any European nation while maintaining distinctive national characteristics. Elizabeth's parliamentary management demonstrated the evolution of English constitutional practices as the Queen systematically used Parliament to legitimize religious settlement while maintaining royal prerogative over foreign policy and administration. The development of parliamentary procedures, the growth of the House of Commons' influence, and the establishment of regular parliamentary sessions created institutional frameworks that would influence later constitutional development while establishing precedents for cooperation between Crown and Parliament. The union of English and Scottish crowns under James I in 1003 represented a crucial step toward British unification while creating new challenges for governmental administration. James's accession brought together two kingdoms with different legal systems, religious traditions, and political cultures while creating opportunities for closer integration between England and Scotland. However, James's Scottish background, his theoretical approach to kingship, and his financial difficulties created tensions with English parliamentary traditions that would influence later constitutional conflicts. The Gunpowder Plot of 1005 revealed continuing Catholic opposition to Protestant rule while demonstrating the effectiveness of governmental intelligence systems in detecting and preventing conspiracy. The systematic investigation of the plot, the trial and execution of its participants, and the subsequent anti-Catholic legislation showed governmental determination to maintain Protestant settlement while creating lasting suspicions of Catholic loyalty that would influence British politics for centuries. James's financial difficulties and his conflicts with Parliament over taxation established patterns of constitutional tension that would dominate the early 17th century. The king's theoretical commitment to divine right monarchy conflicted with parliamentary traditions of consent to taxation, while his expensive court and foreign policy created financial pressures that required parliamentary cooperation. The added Parliament of 1014 and other parliamentary sessions revealed growing tensions between royal prerogative and parliamentary privilege that would culminate in later constitutional crises. The translation of the Bible authorized by James in 1011 represented one of the most significant cultural achievements of early modern England, while demonstrating royal commitment to Protestant religious settlement. The systematic scholarship that produced the King James Version, its literary excellence, and its widespread adoption established a common religious and cultural language that would influence English-speaking peoples throughout the world while strengthening Protestant identity in England and Scotland. Charles I's accession in 1025 marked the beginning of conflicts between royal authority and parliamentary privilege that would culminate in civil war and revolutionary change. Charles's commitment to divine right monarchy, his attempt to rule without parliament during the personal rule from 1029 to 1040, and his religious policies created constitutional and religious crises that would transform English government while establishing precedents for limited monarchy that would influence later constitutional development. The Scottish National Covenant of 1038 and the subsequent Bishops' Wars revealed the limitations of royal authority when opposed by determined popular resistance. Charles's attempt to impose Anglican liturgy on Scotland, the systematic Scottish resistance to religious innovation, and the military failures of English forces showed that effective government required broader consent while demonstrating the continuing importance of religious issues in 17th-century politics. The calling of the Long Parliament in 1040 marked the beginning of systematic parliamentary reform of English government, while establishing precedents for legislative control over royal administration. The Grand Remonstrance, the impeachment of royal ministers, and the passage of legislation limiting royal prerogative created constitutional frameworks that would influence later parliamentary development while demonstrating the evolution of English political thought toward concepts of limited monarchy and governmental accountability. The outbreak of civil war in 1042 represented the failure of constitutional compromise while demonstrating the depth of divisions over religious and political authority in 17th century England. The systematic mobilization of parliamentary and royalist forces, the development of new military organizations like the New Model Army, and the ideological dimensions of the conflict showed that the struggle involved fundamental questions about the nature of political authority while creating precedents for revolutionary change that would influence later political development. The execution of Charles I in 1049 marked a revolutionary moment in European history while demonstrating the logical conclusion of parliamentary sovereignty theories. The systematic trial of the king, the legal justifications for regicide, and the establishment of republican government created precedents for popular sovereignty that would influence later democratic development while shocking European opinion and creating lasting divisions in English society. The Commonwealth and Protectorate periods from 1049 to 1060 demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of republican government, while revealing the institutional strength of English administrative traditions. Oliver Cromwell's military success in Ireland and Scotland established English authority throughout the British Isles, while his domestic policies created religious toleration and administrative efficiency that showed the potential for effective government without monarchy. However, the inability to establish lasting constitutional settlement, the dependence on military force, and the lack of popular support for republican institutions revealed the continuing importance of traditional authority in 17th century society. The restoration of Charles II in 1060 represented a return to traditional monarchy while incorporating constitutional limitations that reflected lessons learned during the Revolutionary period. Charles's acceptance of parliamentary control over taxation, his religious toleration policies, and his careful management of political relationships created conditions for constitutional monarchy that would influence later British governmental development while avoiding the conflicts that had led to civil war. The Great Fire of London in 1066 and Christopher Wren's subsequent rebuilding program demonstrated English architectural and engineering capabilities while creating urban planning precedents that would influence later city development. The systematic reconstruction of London churches, the design of St. Paul's Cathedral, and the creation of new street layouts showed the application of scientific principles to practical problems, while establishing architectural styles that would characterize English building for centuries. The development of modern scientific method by figures like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and Christopher Wren established England as a leader in scientific research while demonstrating the practical applications of scientific knowledge to navigation, engineering, and manufacturing. The founding of the Royal Society in 1060 provided institutional support for scientific research while creating networks of communication that would facilitate technological development and economic growth. James II's accession in 1085 and his subsequent policies revealed the continuing tensions between royal authority and Protestant settlement, while demonstrating the limitations of royal power when opposed by united parliamentary and popular resistance. James's Catholicism, his attempts to promote Catholic interests, and his use of dispensing power to circumvent parliamentary legislation created constitutional crises that would culminate in his overthrow while establishing precedents for parliamentary control over royal succession. The Glorious Revolution of 1088 marked the definitive establishment of parliamentary sovereignty, while creating constitutional frameworks that would characterize British government for centuries. The invitation to William of Orange, his successful invasion, and James's flight to France demonstrated that effective kingship required parliamentary and popular support while establishing precedents for conditional monarchy that would influence later constitutional development throughout the English-speaking world. The Bill of Rights of 1089 systematically defined the limitations on royal authority while establishing parliamentary control over key governmental functions, including taxation, military forces, and religious policy. The systematic enumeration of royal abuses, the definition of parliamentary privileges, and the establishment of regular parliamentary sessions created constitutional frameworks that would serve as models for later democratic development while establishing England as a leader in constitutional government. The Act of Settlement of 1001 established Protestant succession while creating additional limitations on royal authority that would influence later constitutional development. The exclusion of Catholics from the throne, the requirement for parliamentary consent to foreign wars, and the establishment of judicial independence created constitutional principles that would characterize modern British government while demonstrating the evolution of English political thought toward concepts of limited government and separation of powers. The Union of England and Scotland in 1007 created the Kingdom of Great Britain while establishing institutional frameworks that would enable effective governance of the enlarged kingdom. The systematic negotiation of union terms, the preservation of Scottish legal and religious institutions, and the creation of British parliamentary representation demonstrated the possibility of successful political integration while establishing precedents for later imperial governance that would influence British colonial development throughout the world.